We all have cancer, all of us, every single one of us. And they told me I had a few months. As a doctor looking back, I realized I probably had a few days to a few weeks at most.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Nasha Winters, author of The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. She's here to share how ancient wisdom and modern science can transform chronic illness.
80 to 90% of cancers are influenced by lifestyle and environmental factors. So what do you think we need to change?
You do have to start to take inventory. That's one place to start. And that inventory is about, instead of perceiving cancer as the enemy, which is literally what we've been doing since 1971, this war, I will tell you the patients I seem to have the better outcomes is those who start to understand.
50% of us will get cancer in a lifetime and 15% will die from it, supposedly. What have we got wrong about cancer?
Well, basically.
Dr. Nasha Winters, welcome to the show.
So good to be here with you and your tribe. Thanks, Tim.
No worries. I mean, it's fantastic that we're actually sitting down and recording together finally after knowing each other for so many years and being in so many of the same spaces and running past each other, giving each other a hug. And
exactly.
Now we're getting time to stop and chat. So I'm going to dive straight in. At 19, you had stage 4 ovarian cancer and were told you only had a few months left to live and told that nothing could be done. How did this diagnosis make you feel? And, kind of like, what did you do from that point?
Well, that's really where all this story begins. I don't even think I knew what health was. I didn't realize that, of course, until retrospect, until you fully lost your health, do you realize. But, as a kiddo, my mom says I used to try to kick the ashtray off her belly when I was in her belly. So that was probably clue number one. The doctors told my mom when I was an infant that me pooping once a month was just my pattern. And so therefore, that was normal. I was allergic to every formula they could offer because, God forbid, in 1971, would they ever think of giving you breast milk? And so I started this world off with a lot of GI issues from the get-go. By the time I was 9, I started menstruating, which in 1979 was not common, definitely not normal. I was put on birth control pills at 11 for severe endometriosis. I would pretty much bleed for months on end and then have to get transfusions because I would hemorrhage so much. And then later with polycystic ovarian syndrome and cystic acne, of which I did all the treatments for that. And then IBS patterns were finally diagnosed in junior rheumatoid arthritis and cervical dysplasia and cervical cancer and all these patterns before I was 19 years old. And the weird thing is I was never sick. I was never considered sick. It was just normalized and there was another pill for that. So by the time I landed in the ER, after being back and forth trying to see a doctor for many months on end saying something's really wrong, they just thought it was more of the same of my past. So that's where it began. And for me, that moment, you said, what is the first thing you did? Well, the first thing I did was sort of get smacked in the face with the reality of my mortality because I was too far gone. I had 100% bowel blockage. I had kidney, the tumor on my right ovary was pressing against my kidney ureter. So I had a kidney failure. My liver was full of tumors and was in liver failure. I had biliary obstruction. I had fluid built up in my belly. I had no oxygenation getting anywhere in my body. My pulse ox was in the 70s. It was bad. It was dire. And they told me I had a few months. As a doctor looking back, I realized I probably had a few days to a few weeks at most. And I was severely what they would call cachectic or sarcopenic at that time. So the accidental first step was fasting, which is talk about the ultimate biohack. Wouldn't have known this back in 1991. This is before I started doing research. I was pre-med. I was a sophomore in college at the time of my diagnosis. And I couldn't eat. I couldn't eat actually for 2.5 months. And I was going in a couple times a week in the beginning and then once a week and then once every few weeks for getting drained from the ascites while they were making me comfortable as I died. That was sort of the plan. But what was really strange is the more I fasted, the more the fluid started to dry up on its own and not return as quickly. And suddenly the pressure and the pain in my right pelvis started improving and my liver pain started improving and accidentally things started to improve. And on imaging, things started to shrink. And that wasn't expected. And so that is the beginning of what has turned into a 3+ decade adventure, exploration of understanding what is cancer, what was it trying to tell me, and what else might we be able to do to support people on this journey.
Isn't it amazing how the body self-corrects when the right things are removed and the right things are put in, opposed to just relying on chemicals, specific medicines and stuff? Isn't it amazing?
Quite astonishing. In fact, I've gotten to watch this happen for hundreds of other people over my career in a similar form or fashion of folks who were given no other option, no other alternative. And sometimes the most simplistic approaches can make some of the biggest difference.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
So were all these symptoms in your youth like genetically inherited or a sign of cancer to come, do you think?
I think it was probably a crossroad of both. My family of origin had a lot of health issues, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, other types of cancer, thyroid dysfunction. I mean, just kind of all the things, right? My father eventually died of cancer. My mom had multiple cancer types from thyroid to ovarian to breast, but they all just did them through surgery because they were early stage. Just a lot of these piles, which we didn't know. It was in the 1990s, we didn't know, or 1970s, we didn't know this information. But fast forward in 1996, after my diagnosis, I was diagnosed in 91. In 1996, they started doing testing for BRCA. The BRCA mutation, which is a DNA repair mutation, which a lot of people know maybe as the Angelina Jolie gene. And I actually had mutations for both. I was a really rare bird, which doesn't surprise me, just given the other weird genes I've learned about since. But I had a BRCA mutation on both BRCA1 and 2, showing a higher familial propensity towards both breast and ovarian cancer. And so they learned that because they were at that time started testing in young adults who were having these types of cancers to look for familial patterns. So I was one of the first people tested in that area and learned about that. It would still take another decade or more before we understood it fully, and started to understand that it's not a death sentence. And in fact, one thing for your listeners to really know is that only 5% of all cancer types have this particular genetic expression, and it doesn't have any change on the overall survival rate. So we kind of make a big ado about nothing when we could actually be doing a lot more in prevention and in helping people understand how do you take care of your DNA? How do you methylate better, which are what I've learned to do for myself and many others over the years. The other thing is later epigenetics, when we could start running our 23andMe tests and ancestry DNA tests and started learning a lot more, especially at a time when they were able to do a lot more high penetrance gene testing in the early days of 23andMe. That's where I started learning about a lot of these other genes that they don't ever test for anymore for the average consumer, but started to understand I carried the gene for cystic fibrosis. So did, weirdly, my husband, both of us being homozygous. So if we ever did have children, we would likely have a child with cystic fibrosis, which I thought was a very interesting find. Learned about the Parkinson's gene, learned about the BRCA mutation. Those were the things I started to understand were genetics that had familial tendencies, but they're also genetics that we can do something about. We can overcome. And then I learned, as I showed one of my really good friends, really good colleagues, Dr. Ben Lynch, who wrote the book Dirty Genes and is really well known in the epigenetic space. I blacked out the name of this patient and showed him the SNP profile. And I was like, what would you say to this patient? And he kind of looked at it and he's like, you're fucked. I mean, that was like really what he said. And then he's like, oh, wait a minute. That wasn't you, was it? I'm like, yeah, that's me, which I knew. I already knew this because I was studying and realizing I had a lot against me. I'm missing the GSTP1, the GSTM1 SNP. So basically my body doesn't know how to take out the garbage. So I had that combination of familial high penetrance genes with diet and lifestyle and environmental burdens that my body has to work harder than the average Joe to deal with. And so it's just become a lifelong journey of understanding my own body, my own physiology, my own genetic predispositions, and know how to hack them to express in a different way.
That's amazing. I mean, I said this on probably 15 at least of the podcasts I've recorded now. Some of the best people that I've spoken to have gone through the health issues themselves. They've learned to apply it to themselves, and then they want to help others not have to go through that, myself included, although obviously I'm not medically qualified. And so it's really nice to hear, because I heard recently a saying of don't take investing advice from a homeless person, i.e. like you want the heuristic of who's the person in the situation you want to be in, not someone that's never been anywhere near it. So I love that part of your story. And I didn't realize it was quite so extreme. Obviously, I'm very, very familiar with your work for obvious reasons, but I didn't realize it was quite such a long, hard journey. And it's funny you mentioned methylation, because as you were saying this, I was like, the usual endometriosis and whatnot, and the methylation tie is quite significant. And I've been doing methylation now since 2015. And obviously, since Gary Brecker came along and started screaming about it, which is amazing, it's much more mainstream. So it's great to hear that you stumbled across that as well. So Why did accidental fasting help you?
Well, great question. Again, it's such really interesting. There's a study, Dr. Moreschi, Moreschi from 1909, was showing that he was able to debulk or lower the growth of tumors and diminish the growth of tumors just with fasting. And so we actually had fasting as part of a natural approach to a lot of health conditions all the way up until the early 1960s. It's very much like we kind of evolved. I mean, we have evolved with fasting. In fact, I was just on an interview with a colleague of mine who's in her month of Ramadan right now. And we were talking about the amazing studies around the impact of the fasting through Ramadan's impact on our metabolic health. But we have evolved, spiritually and as humanity with fasting. And we used it as a tool in medical treatment up until the 1960s. And then someone got it in their head, of like, oh, the last thing you want to do to someone struggling is to deprive them further. And so we then started to switch the recommendations, especially to cancer patients, to no matter what, don't lose weight. Ugh, God, like those words, I wish I could just eradicate them from our vocabulary. And also like, oh, we don't want them to starve. It's like the other part of it, and we can talk about this in a moment, the weight loss of just caloric restriction versus the weight loss of a metabolic shift are very different animals, and they respond very differently. So increasing your calories in someone who's dealing with cachexia is actually about the worst thing you can do if you're getting the wrong type of calories on board. We can unpack that in a moment. But basically, we've had a lot of studies showing the impact that fasting itself can turn off some of the signaling pathways to tell cancer cells to grow, or to proliferate, or to move about the building. We have lots of studies showing that the impact of fasting will lower inflammation and a lot of the other cytokines that are very specific in driving patterns of things like angiogenesis, which is new blood flow and growth to the tumor itself, resources being shunted to the tumor versus the healthy body. And we have a lot of studies showing its impact on creating these ketone bodies, which are really powerful signaling agents that enhance and potentiate suppressive, anti-proliferative impact. They induce apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. They do all kinds of really cool things. And we can achieve ketones through a variety of ways. Most people know about the ketogenic diet, which is just one way to do that, which is high fat with low carbs and normal to low protein levels. You can do it with just fasting. You can even do it with exogenous ketones or just simply carb restricting or caloric restricting. And so there's a multitude of ways to bring ketone bodies to the rescue, which have this beautiful way of entering into all of the hallmarks of cancer and having a positive impact in potentiating other cancer therapies, as well as having impact by themselves.
I love the amount of press or research, and even on Stephen Bartlett's podcast recently was an episode about this, specifically talking about that. And it had a lot of pushback, unfortunately, that episode.
Of course.
But also the thing is with fasting is no food, no nothing. You can't really make money from that. Yeah, I mean, it's like, why do it, it's like, I heard a meme, I saw a meme the other week, and it's like, we don't want people cycling in the city because then they're not buying cars, they're not using fuel, and we don't want people walking because they don't buy a bicycle.
Wow.
It's like, It's a pretty crazy world, isn't it, when it comes to money? Yeah.
So we could be rebels and not, and not eat, in these ways. It's pretty wild. And, we've got like some good public figures. So people like Dr. Jason Fung wrote a great general book on fasting for those who just want to use it for general kind of life hacks. And then he wrote a one called The Cancer Code, which is a little more specific in how it can be instrumental in the cancering process. And then just a few weeks ago, our colleague, Dr. Valter Longo's book on cancer and fasting came out, which is really unpacking the research in this impact. And so, to go from fasting was very part of our medical system to it being really pushed out of popularity and even ridiculed and even fought and suppressed, to the resurgence in the research environment in academic institutions and among researchers and clinicians around the globe to realize this free, accessible, universal tool is there for all of us to utilize.
Yeah, the key word there is free. I mean, whereas you can have jelly and cakes and everything and lollipops in hospital after you've had your cancer surgery. I mean, it just is a little bit weird. So you go by the label of integrative oncologist. Can you explain exactly what that is?
Sure, sure. Well, most people understand. So an oncologist, by the way, the people who can only legally call themselves someone who treats cancer is someone who's board certified as an oncologist or board certified as a dental surgeon. Those are the only people from standard of care that are legally allowed to diagnose and treat cancer. Okay. So I am an integrative oncology specialist, and my specialty is to help the conventional oncologists do their job better.
Right.
I am a terrain expert as well as a tumor expert. And so I'm that bridge to help people understand that there's a lot more going on around that tumor itself that actually has a lot more impact than the tumor environment itself. And so that's where I focus. But the sort of definitive definition of this is integrative oncology assumes this more holistic approach that takes the best of standard of care with the best of vetted alternative care, and everything in between. The growing or emerging field of integrative oncology today is still, in my opinion, a little bit behind the ball. They play it safe. I call most of the integrative oncology community that's out there are still considered very much like backup singers, or they're actually even at the small table in the garage for Thanksgiving dinner. Like they're allowed to eat with the group, but they're not really able to sit at the big boy table. Right. Mm. And so what they're willing to bring into academic institutions and call integrative are things like yoga, Reiki, breath work, some of the more mind-body techniques. They're very comfortable to talk about that. But when you talk into dietary, like therapeutic dietary interventions, that's a hell no in those environments, because then you're going to compete with the RD nutritionists who are the industry-driven, narrative-pushing nutrition. I have a lot of what they call recovery RD nutritionists in my training program. So we hear this firsthand. You're not allowed to talk about like innovative therapies, like how do you stack certain therapies to enhance the impact of chemotherapy or radiation. So you don't often get it, at least in the United States, you don't get to really talk about the application of hyperbaric oxygen, for instance, in a fasted state in conjunction with radiation therapy, which will open up those cells to respond more so to the radiation, will make those cancer cells more vulnerable and more sensitized to the radiation, and actually protect the healthy tissue around it. So you're not causing damage there. That's true integration. And that's the integration that I'm interested in talking about. That's unfortunately not very interesting to many people in the integrative oncology space, because it's perceived as trying to sit at the table with the conventional oncology team, which is where we rightfully belong, as a team approach of doing better for our patients. And that's all that should matter. Yeah,
it's amazing. I mean, it makes me think of biological dentistry and Dr. Dom, because this is exactly the same, or it's a very similar situation to biological dentistry. It's like they're kind of poo-pooed by traditional dentists, even though the traditional dentists, in my opinion, which are great at fixing bites and getting you out of pain, but they are a bit of a dinosaur these days, and they're still stuck on the whole fluoride thing being okay. I mean, that kind of says everything. But the interesting thing is, if natural care worked on its own, there would never be a need for medicine. And then if medicine worked, there wouldn't be any need for natural care. So
you nailed it.
By presupposition, if traditional oncology worked, there wouldn't be a need for anything else. And if traditional dentistry worked, there wouldn't be a need for something else. But there is something else that seems to be working. When are they going to catch up and go, hang on a minute, like we're going to use our common sense over here? It just seems a bit crazy.
Well, they say it takes, it takes a generation of doctors to die before things change. Now that's a horrible adage, but that is really well known in the history books. It's like until sort of the dinosaurs, go extinct, the room for new ideas, can new ideas emerge. But I've been at this, you guys, for over 30 years, and the studies are there. The data is there. The research is there. And the enormous blocks against this, in both camps. So I will tell you, in my opinion, I think that the standard of care alone model, as you so beautifully articulated, is not enough. And I also believe, much to the chagrin of many of my colleagues in the alternative space, that alternative alone is not enough, especially when you're getting into a stage 3 or 4 cancer. Maybe in a stage 1 or 2, there's more that can be done without much needed interventions. But when you get into the zone where now there's massive heterogeneity, there's a lot more players, a lot more signaling molecules, a lot more at stake. juicing this isn't going to do anything. If not, it's going to knock you off the cliff even faster, right? And so the other side of it is a stage 1 cancer or a stage 0 cancer may not need to be hit with the bulldozer, and bringing in all the tools that will actually lead to further, more aggressive cancers in the future, which we have the data showing that as well.
See, this is one of the things I read about probably a few years back now, but I'm sure you'll be able to clarify it for me, is that there's a specific percentage, quite a high percentage of cancers that are cured, which means generally it means within a 5-year period they don't die, I think it is. And then, but what they don't say is that they end up dying afterwards from a secondary cancer because their immune system's been hit so hard, but they don't report that because it's claimed as cured on the first one. So they say, here's our cure, here's what it does, you'll be okay. But what happens, like, it's not a forever after story. So can you shed a bit of light on that?
Sure. So you're speaking to a very interesting dynamic that doesn't happen anywhere else in medicine, which is that if you survive to 5 years out from your initial diagnosis, you're considered cured, even if you died 5 years and 1 day later. The data just sort of stops looking at it beyond that point. We've only in the last few years started to look at, now we're even able to see that breast cancers 15, 20 years later recur. They're not brand new cancers. They're the same cancer that is now alive and well and expressing in the body. We're able to see that certain cancers, like, for instance, renal cell carcinoma, which is a kidney cancer, has 100% cure rate when you cut out the tumor and the kidney that contains the tumor. But there's almost 100% recurrence rate. And by the time it recurs, it's often impossible to bring into remission. It just explodes. And so we are misleading the public to understand that, at the end of your treatment, when you ring that bell after chemo or after radiation from the standard of care model, that should not be your mark of the end of the journey. It's actually the mark at the beginning of the journey. Because your job really, if I'm lucky enough to see you before you're diagnosed, great. Because the only treatment, the only prevention of cancer, or the only cure for cancer is prevention. Okay. So ultimately, that's where I'd love to see you. But when people are in the journey of cancer, there's a heck of a lot they can do to understand the why, the chronology, or even the biography that led to the biology and the expression of cancer. And there's a lot that can be done to support and enhance the impact of standard of care while protecting the healthy cells and that sacred immune system that is required to keep it at bay once you ring that bell. And then the next part, which Western medicine does zero for, is this concept of survivorship, which is the long game. Now, their idea of long game is, we'll see you next year for another scan. Let's add some more radiation into an already vulnerable system, shall we? And no one is really checking out their bloods to see that their bone marrow is not recouping as quickly as it should, or maybe their neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio hasn't resolved, or their T cells are now exhausted and now they're very vulnerable to other types of diseases, including cancer, new cancers, and recurred. We aren't doing a good enough job for our patients after they complete the standard of care. And so there's a role for an integrative approach in every step of the journey. And what I have experienced in my 30 years of practice with direct care in tens of thousands of patients and indirect care of training clinicians and their thousands and thousands of patients is that those who bring a thoughtful methodology of test and assess before you address, so no guessing here, anywhere along that journey, these patients have much better outcomes. And so just an example, I'm always careful about because we're actually building the data platform to gather this information to then publish this information. But I can tell you in the early evaluation of this, if you took all stage 4 cancers and you threw them into a bucket and you said, what percentage of these stage 4 cancers are here 5 years from now, are still alive 5 years and a day from now? Depending on the research you're looking at, it says 5 to 12% survival rate. Okay. That's with all the like stage 4 cancers in one bucket. And that could be everything from GBMs and pancreatic, really aggressive, short-lived, to, stage 4 breast cancer or whatever it is, or even kidney cancer. When we apply this different methodology, what we're seeing is a closer to 65 to 70% are still here at that time. Now, that is a big freaking difference. And yet, if I try and talk about that, I get attacked in the most unbelievable way. Because they say, you're a charlatan, you're lying, this isn't possible. There's no data. Well, there is data, but no one has ever wanted to fund the studies for it, fund the collection of this data, fund the publishing of this data, fund the statisticians to evaluate this data, which takes an enormous amount of resources. We have been collecting and doing just that for some time and hope to be publishing some meaningful data to show that you can, in fact, do cancer better. Okay. And so that's the piece here of the puzzle, is that it should not be just one way. There's a multitude of ways to both prevent, to support through, and to deal with survivorship after.
One thing that just came up for me while you were saying that is actually an interesting point. You know, for instance, with some of these cancers, if it's dealt with and then later on it comes back, it's like, well, if it's just cut out, surely the system, the body is going, I can't deal with this. It's going wrong. I need something to operate correctly. And then you cut out the problem. It's like, okay, great. I've got the burden off. But the system still needs the right juice to operate correctly. So it's always going to come back unless you find, I hate to say it, the root cause, right?
Yeah. And you got to say it. I mean, you cannot fully heal from the environment in which you got sick. So you might be able to pluck that weed right out, but 10 more will come behind it.
Yeah.
If you don't change the environment in which that weed took root.
Okay, so 50% of us will get cancer in a lifetime and 15% will die from it, supposedly. It causes 26,000 deaths every day, which is nearly 10 million a year. What have we got wrong about cancer?
Well, basically, first of all, you're giving the very compelling and up-to-date statistics on this. And since we, claimed the war on cancer in 1971 with the National Cancer Act, we have virtually had a flatline of overall survival or progression-free survival. We have not made a big enough dent with the tools we've used, which was coming from that genetic model that Theodore Bovary came up with in 1914, saying that cancer is a genetic disease. We've not made an impact with what we utilize today in standard of care oncology around the globe, which is known as the maximum tolerated dose, meaning we're going to napalm the field so much that nothing can survive. And we just hope that a few of your healthy cells will come back and carry on. Right. That's our approach. That is what it's called. MTD, maximum tolerated dose. That has failed our patients. We also haven't used the metrics to understand which patients are going to respond to which therapies better. So we have the tools and technologies today to even test their pharmacogenomics to know, hey, do you have the DYPD gene? So the F5FU, the methotrexates, the FOLFIRI-FOLFINOX treatments that are part of so many cancer treatments out there might backfire or not work at all for you. Those types of things. So then how do we overcome that? We can support that gene to express better, by the way. Why are we not using these tools in every single patient, every single time that are available? I see dozens of patients who go to high-end, high-dollar academic institutions and run this meaningful testing on tissue or blood biopsies, and then they do nothing with the data. They still put them on the NCCN guidelines, the standard of care, and what they'll tell the patient is, oh, we won't give you the treatment that you actually tested for until you fail these other models.
I wonder
these
why.
Other lines of therapy.
I wonder why. I mean,
exactly. Because we got a lot of stuff there. So it's like, this is what's crazy. So you say what's not working. A lot of things aren't working. We're not asking the right questions. We're not applying a lot of the tools and technologies we actually have today. And we're perpetuating the problem by thinking we can poison the body back into health.
Irony. So why do you argue that we shouldn't be waging a war against cancer?
Boy, that is a compelling question. I get hate mail for this response, by the way. So I'm bracing myself, but I've got tough skin. I can handle it, which is this. We all have cancer all the time. All of us. Every single one of us. The expression of cancer to the point of diagnosis and maybe symptoms, because some people get diagnosed without any symptoms, right? But let's say just diagnosis and or symptoms will hit 50% of us. It's a flip of a coin today that you will be met with a cancer diagnosis in your lifetime. Instead of perceiving cancer as the enemy, which is literally what we've been doing since 1971, this war on the enemy as this sort of perceived outside invader, with all of the folks out there with the fuck cancer, monographs and all the pieces here of like, this is such the enemy. It's something that's come in and causing me problems. I will tell you the patients that seem to have the better outcomes is those who start to understand what cancer is trying to teach them. It's trying to tell them about the environment that they have been born and raised in, about the environment of both what they're putting in, on, and around their bodies, the environment of the people they choose to spend their time with, the communities, the jobs they dwell in. These things impact the expression of our genetics. They impact our immune system function. They impact the nutrients required to be resilient and meet all of the assaults that we get, an average of 60,000 assaults a day on our mitochondria that in normal circumstances, they can keep up until they can't, right? And so for me, I have looked at through a different lens that cancer is us. It's an extension of us, and it's just forgotten how to be in community with our healthy cells, with our healthy environment. And instead of severing it and trying to remove it, you can do that to help lift the burden a bit so the body has more resources. That's one avenue, but you also need to understand it. And you need to understand that it's trying to tell you something, that something is not right in the environment. So I look at cancer as a messenger. And it's just like kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? It's like bigger problems here, guys, pay attention, change things. But it's also an opportunity. And that sounds very cliche. And you'll hear every single time, every patient I've ever worked with will say to me, I can maybe think on one hand where if someone didn't say this, which is cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. And that's really hard. People in the first part, they are not happy to hear me say this. But over time, especially if the people that I work with and the way we start to understand it and we start to kind of create relationship with it and communication with it, people start to recognize it's a wake-up call. It's an opportunity. It's a messenger to live your life very differently. Folks when I had a private practice of 2,500 patients in a small town, mountain town in Colorado, I had a very active practice of just general family care. I got burnt out. It became really hard. And I'm sorry if any of my old patients are listening to this, but it's really painful when someone's like, oh, I feel like shit. I feel like shit. I feel like shit. I feel like shit. But they're not doing anything about it. Or I'm really unhappy. I'm really unhappy. I'm really unhappy. But they're not changing their circumstances. Cancer is one of the most amazing communities to work with because cancer makes the people who choose to step in and change everything, to live their life with such deep intention and awareness and to make the necessary changes to give their lives and their cells a fighting chance.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it often takes an extreme change to wake us up sometimes. I mean, it's like whether it's a bad relationship, whether it's bad health issue, whether it's whatever, I think, it makes you appreciate that it could all just go in a second. And often whereas when it's only a slight little, like a little headache once a week, it doesn't bother you enough to make a radical shift. So it's great. I mean, like you hear people that have lost a limb or, been bound in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, they end up becoming often, so happy and grateful for life, whereas in the perspective before losing a limb or being in a wheelchair, you're like, no, I never want that for my life. But obviously, so it's actually very interesting. So you mentioned the pulling out the weeds analogy. And, and we've got an article from PubMed that says 80 to 90% of cancers are influenced by lifestyle and environmental factors. So what do you think we need to change?
Oh my gosh, where do we begin? Actually, there's other studies that show upwards of 95%, but let's just be really conservative and say 80%. That's still significant, right? That's significant saying that we have 80% of an impact on what expresses in our own bodies. And so you do have to start to take inventory. That's one place to start. And that inventory is about looking at everything and everyone you put in, on, and around you. Okay. And I mean that literally as well as figuratively and energetically as well as tangibly. And so the world has changed a lot in the last, 150, 200 years, especially since World War II. What we have brought into the world, major changes, are changes in the chemicals. We've brought over 100,000 new chemicals to the world with very little appropriate testing and even less testing of how they interact with each other. That's one. Number two, we've gone from an average in most countries of the world of 5 pounds of sugar per person per year to upwards of, depending on the studies you look at, 145 to 175 pounds of sugar per person per year. So we've kind of deranged our nutritional balance in that way. We've drastically changed the way we raise and treat animals and how we're factory farming them and feeding them away from their own natural genetic tendencies, which then impacts our animals, which impacts us. So we are what we eat, but also what the animals eat. So if we're still ingesting animals that are now like being fattened up on corn when they've always grazed on grass, that's going to change their composition, as it will ours. When we look at the misinformation of science, which we learned in the last few years that the sugar industry was basically paid off to bastardize fat and support the movement of sugar in the sugar industry, and so we kind of blamed the wrong person or the wrong situation for what was really going on with us. We made a lot of changes through the good of science. We, after World War II, took all that leftover ammo and said, hey, let's put this into agriculture and into big pharma. And a lot of our problems have come on really strong since the end of the 1940s, early 1950s. We have so many changes to our environment. It's now pretty much ubiquitous in our environment, our rainwater, our soil, our air, and our water of glyphosate. Massive endocrine disruptor. It's basically ubiquitous that if you're drinking your city water, you're drinking other people's chemotherapy and their antidepressants and their hormone replacement and their, blood pressure meds. That's not being filtered out of their water systems. These are the types of things that when people say, gosh, I don't understand why we're getting sicker and sicker and younger and why cancer is exploding in younger generations of a disease that used to be considered a disease of the aged. The fact that we go, scratch our head and wonder makes me like, where the fuck are you? Like, how do you not even open your eyes and pay attention to see, of course, we're a hot mess, but it's so daunting that for most people, it's overwhelming and it puts them into a paralysis versus a action of what you can do. And so I think we need to just start simply by just evaluate everything you're putting in, on, and around. We train patient advocates to walk patients through their homes, through their pantries, through their medicine cabinets, through what's under the kitchen sink, what's in the fridge, what's in the pantry, what's in the freezer, to start there. Like, what can you simply start to change or exchange?
It's funny because two things that sprung to mind as you're saying this was about if we talk about environmental factors versus genetics. I saw a meme on Instagram, and it seems like I see a lot of content on there. And it was like there was two obese people, and they said, "Oh, obesity runs in the family," and then on the other side, a little cat's pointing, saying, "Nobody runs in your family." And it just made me think. It's like people just mark it off as, "Oh yeah, it's genetic," but actually, are you eating the same things at the same time in the same household? And if you move to wherever, would that change? All those lifestyle changes or environmental changes are, pretty obvious. And it's, I mean, I think to me anyway, and I talk about all this stuff on Instagram a lot. For instance, I shared out a post last week about some cleaner laundry detergent. And it says, if you're drinking filtered water and eating organic food, but you're still using laundry detergent that's toxic, you've got it all wrong. And I had so much hate for this post. It's just like ridiculous. They're like, yeah, but you don't get it. You're walking around with these chemicals that are hormone disrupting on your clothes all day, every day, yet you're drinking filtered water and eating organic food thinking that you're safe. And then I get told I'm a fearmongerer. And then obviously the two other things I just want to add to your list actually is seed oils. And I hate to be one of these seed oil haters, but after recording with Dr. Kate Shanahan, who's wonderful, by the way, and hearing about how seed oils actually eat up your own antioxidants as well as being pro-oxidants. So it's almost like a turbo boost of inflammation. And then combine that with the lack of grounding, then inflammation is going to be at an all-time high, and inflammatory disease, well, all the issues that inflammation causes, especially to help exacerbate things like cancer. So it's like when you pile all these things up together, it's the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
Exactly. Well, it's interesting. I too have been called a fearmonger, and what I tell people, like in my book, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, it can really overwhelm people. And I say, don't shoot the messenger. I'm simply pointing out, because I will tell you, almost every person that I've ever consulted with or on their behalf said, I was healthy until I got cancer. I don't understand why me. It doesn't take much detective work to see what the other triggers were, because you cannot exercise away a shitty diet. You can't biohack away a bad lifestyle. Like you can't just be like, okay, I'm going to stay up and watch YouTube all night but I'll sit in front of my red light in the afternoon and wear my blue blockers and do my thing all day. Like we see that too, right? Exactly. And so there's always something. And you're right. The world it can be overwhelming. So you have to do the best you can with the information you learn. If you didn't know something, no harm. But once you know and you continue, it does become in your own power. So we have to start somewhere. And these places of starting to just be curious, to become a living laboratory, to start to test and assess your own terrain, to do the audit on your life and your home and your living and surroundings of people and places in your world. You can do certain testing. There's a lot of different ways to do that. You can even just do simple questionnaires. In the book itself, there's a very modified, very simple questionnaire, but we can put a link to this in the podcast of a deeper dive that actually quantifies and qualifies and offers insight to what your priorities are, maybe what your blind spots are that you weren't aware of. So you can start someplace simply, because it can completely put you into that paralysis place. But man, I get the hate mail all the time of people saying, well, you're blaming me. No, I'm not. I'm trying to help you see what's around you so you can make different choices. Every single moment we have is a choice.
Do you know what? I love that. I absolutely love that. I mean, there's a saying I heard, which was, it wasn't from Instagram, this one. It was, when you know better, do better. And the other thing is from you sharing out information, it's almost like when people say, you should not be talking about this and you get so much hate. It's like, should I not share the stuff I found? Do I not have a responsibility to the world to try and make it a better place, to help put out information that I have found to be true? You don't have to accept it because I put it out. So should I only talk about what you want me to talk about, which means that there's no advancements, which is the definition of science, to constantly be proving itself wrong so that we can get closer to the truth, right? So when people say that, it's like, I'm sorry, but you need to understand what common sense is, because it should be more common. And there's another Instagram. I mean, yeah. So I love your point. I love your point on that. It's it rings very true for me.
Yeah. And there's something, this is why I will tell you something that's been really interesting to me in the last, 10, 12 years of my career. I have always been like the curious and reading. And I mean, I read thousands of books and thousands of research articles, every year. It's just what I do. I'm just a curious by nature kind of gal. But the biggest changes I have seen made in healthcare and in cancer care, even more so, has not been from my colleagues in oncology or the researchers in these big academic institutions, right? It's been in the biohacker community. Super wild. And the biohacker community, here's my theory, and I would love for you to tell me if I'm wrong, or qualify this here, is that the biohacker community tends to be filled with a lot of data-driven people and a lot of systems thinking people, a lot of folks from tech and engineering world that see things as systems where standard of care medicine is very linear and very siloed and not good at putting dots together. And so I feel like the biggest shift in medicine and healthcare and in the interests of innovations and research has come from non-medical people. You said earlier, like, oh, I'm not a medical person, so I shouldn't be taught. Like, some of the best information we've learned is from non-medical people. And so it's like, well, then let's take their living laboratory experiences and do further testing and evaluation, which is exactly what we've been doing. And so starting to understand the power of light therapy, sound therapy, grounding therapy, fasting therapy, certain nutrient density, therapies. So much of that has come out of the world of biohackers.
Well, it's funny because one of our vendors, whose name I will not mention, said to me, we want you to test. No, I said to them, I want to test out your technology before I allow it to the show. Okay. And they said, okay, but our studies and work has been done over thousands of people. I said, yeah, but I want to go to the lab and I want to reproduce it on myself. And this person said, but that's just you. That's not enough data. I said, it's an N=1. It gives me an idea of what works for me. It may not work for me, and I'm prepared for that. However, N=1. And now if we do this with 1,000 people, That's a lot more data. And I think the data-driven approach is fantastic. And also the system thinking, because when I got ill back in 2013, 14, and the doctors shrugged their shoulders, which I've said on so many podcasts so many times, I'm bored of saying it, but it's quite funny because I said, what's wrong with me? And he shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. And that's when I went home with a pack of Post-it notes and I wrote down all the different symptoms and all the things that I had going on, stuck them on the wall, and then researched every single one of them. And at the time, there wasn't Instagram, so I obviously had more time in my life. But there was Reddit, and there was Cure Zone, and there was all the different other forums of people, and Floxies, and all this stuff that I remember, and Liver Flushes before, early days of Andreas's book. And I just thought, what does it all trace back to? And then I researched for months and months and months and months until I traced it back to the top thing until methylation came along, which was mercury toxicity. And then in 2015-ish, I guess, I heard about methylation. And then that was the reason I wasn't detoxifying my mercury, et cetera, properly. So the systems thinking approach, I think, helped me go from falling apart to, I would like to think, thriving for the most part. And I think this is why biohacking is actually working, because it is the systems thinking, like non-bias. The only bias is health. It's not financial. It's what works.
And you speak so beautifully about the power of this. Our standard research models and our standard medical models are always looking at like these big, huge studies, and everyone gets the exact same dose at the exact same rate. And we expect, we look at this bell-shaped curve and we completely disregard any of the outliers, and we cherry pick out the people that didn't have the experience we wanted and just don't even talk about them. And then we only show the favorable results and even cherry pick that. That it does such a disservice, because to your point, I could put 10 different people, the same demographic, the same diagnosis, even a lot of the same drivers, like metabolic drivers. And yet their response to various therapies are going to depend on entirely unique situations inside of them. And so that N of one, we need to change our thinking our research into an N of one approach, which is a whole different change in how we approach and apply research, and move into a systems thinking model, and get out of the silos and get out of even the specializations. Like, even though I'm a specialist in oncology, I was a specialist in family medicine and an expert in endocrinology and immunology and all these other tools because cancer is a collection of hundreds of diseases. Even the American Cancer Society says that. So I needed to understand the human condition, the human biochemistry and physiology, to even understand and start to scratch the surface of what cancer might be trying to tell us. And so we have to break down the current system and rebuild a new one.
Yeah, it's crazy when you say that about the studies, and they're like, oh yeah, how many people do we need to pull out of it so it looks better? We'll find a reason. And there's loads of those examples. And yet they call biohackers quacks.
I know.
And yet we're just we're not just going with the data. There are some really out there biohackers doing some really fringe, crazy, weird shit. There's one that's quite mainstream right now, which is doing a service and a disservice at the same time to us biohackers. But when we look at the data, like for instance the Oura Ring or the glucose monitor and all these things, and we say we are doing this, I feel that's far more quantified and effective. Given all of this, Nasha, what does a typical treatment protocol look like after?
Well, we start with testing each person. We do an N of one evaluation. We take in as much data as we can. We have a 50-page intake process, right? So right there, if patient's like 50 pages, I'm not doing that. Well, then you weeded yourself out. Bye-bye. Because this is right. I'm like, good, fine. This isn't for everybody, because it takes a certain amount of responsibility and accountability and curiosity to do this approach. Right? It's not spoon-fed to you, and it's not a protocol. So we gather that data, and we gather that data through labs, functional testing, epigenetic testing, so your single nucleotide polymorphisms, where appropriate, blood and or tissue biopsy data from the tumor cells or the tumor pathways. We even do evaluations of the wearables that we've mentioned here, and even from ancient diagnoses like tongue and pulse diagnosis from Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, which is also an area of interest that I studied in for many, many moons as well. And so all of that is just information. Like, let's find out who this person is. We also take into account their biography. So we really evaluate for like ACE scores, adverse childhood event scores, big and little T experiences, how their body processes trauma, how their vagal nerve is responding. So we can get that from wearable devices, vagal nerve, because if a person's in a sympathetic state, it's going to be very difficult no matter what you do for it to have a good impact. right? So if you're constantly in that revving state, it's not going to change anything. So HRV is a really powerful tool. Once we gather the data, then we assess it. We assess it through just this pattern recognition, like who are you? What brought you to this moment and what might be the best fit based on the data from standard and alternative, the best vetted of alternative care that might be a really good path forward to start. And then we start. We choose the therapies that fit best for that individual at that time, dose, duration, and combination. And it's iterative. We continue to test on a monthly basis until they are stable or completely no evidence of disease. And then we still continue to test beyond that to make sure if they did have some more harmful cytotoxic therapies that we've cleaned up from that system and made sure that basically all systems are a go again. And so I know people want me to be very tangible about the what is it, but that's going to depend entirely on you, the person's situation, and the goal. Some patients come to us at the very end of life, very end, who've exhausted all therapies, and there's not much left to work with. Their T cells are completely exhausted. Their guts are completely destroyed. And if a microbiome isn't functioning, neither is your immune system. Their quality of life, their hunger signals are now gone from severe cachexia, sarcopenia. And now you're just dealing with this shell. Well, sometimes our job is to help them have a good death. Sometimes our job is to help them suck the marrow out of life for the moments they have left. And I can't even tell you how many times I've seen beautiful deaths, if you will. We can definitely live and thrive into dying and heal into dying. But those who come through the treatment, there's the sky's the limit on the direction where we can go from this. And then we are certainly about educating and empowering the patient, because an empowered, educated patient is very difficult to kill a patient. We want people to live long, happy lives and die of something completely unrelated at a ripe old age. But life happens, and tomorrow isn't guaranteed in any situation, in any person's condition. And so we try a tool of empowerment, education, inquiry, and applying the right treatments at the right time, dose, and duration based on that N of 1.
So let's get some actionables. What are the 10 root causes of cancer that we need to address in order to start tracking the disease and bringing it down from these insane numbers?
Yeah, well, let's start looking at the 10 drops in your mitochondrial bucket. Because your mitochondria are those little, organelles in your cells that are taking in all the information. Everything you're putting in, on, and around you go right into those little mitochondria. And then they translate that information and send signals out into the body to respond in a particular way. So you want to make sure you're giving it good information so it responds in a favorable way. So the 10 major drops are epigenetics. So what has been passed down for upwards of 12 generations, ahead of you that shows potential or propensities, but that you have control over changing. So understand your vulnerabilities and do something about it before it becomes a problem. Deal with the smoldering ember in the basement. Don't wait for it to be a house engulfed in flames. That would be step number 1. Step number 2 is the metabolic drop in the bucket. How are you fueling those cells? What are the right macros for you based on your life, your genetics, your goals? Sometimes it is going to be methionine restriction or glutamine restriction. Sometimes it's going to be therapeutic ketosis. Sometimes it's going to be just fasting. It's going to depend on what you're needing and why at the moment, but you still need to look at how your body is as having its metabolic flexibility, and its insulin response is going to be a big one. Everyone should really get their insulin under control. Number 3, toxins. It's no longer a matter if you have toxicity, it's how bad is it and how does it interface with your terrain, with your system. So you can sort of assume that you have toxins and save money there and invest in a good water filter and a good air filter. Or you can do further testing and find out if you have, like Tim did, like major mercury, which is a massive endocrine disruptor and snuffs out your mitochondria. It's one of the most mitochondrial poisons on the planet. So no wonder you had that whole slew of conditions. Then we look at number 4, the microbiome. I mean, my God, this is huge. Now that the whole planet is basically swimming in glyphosate, we've destroyed ubiquitously our microbiome because the glyphosate behaves like an antibiotic. And so that's what it's doing into our food crops. And that's what it's doing inside of our crop. And then we look at your immune system. I mean, we've just come out of a pandemic, which no one seemed to bother about asking about how your immune system was doing, and the interrelation between your microbiome and your metabolic health and all of this. But your immune system matters. And so really knowing and optimizing your vitamin D levels, really not putting in things that are going to degrade your immune system further, like stress and sugar. Those are the types of things to consider. Then inflammation. We're all inflamed today, just depending on what's driving that process. Stress is actually one of the biggest causes of inflammation in our body. And then we look at oxygenation. Many of us are hypoxic, walking around with low oxygen levels without even knowing it. So a cheap little pulse oximetry on your finger, a sleep study, perhaps if you're not sleeping well. Cancer loves hypoxia, loves low oxygen environments. So breath and movement are really critical to keep that oxygen flowing. Hormones, I know you guys started your conversation before I came on today about that, but we're swimming in a huge endocrine disrupting soup today. And so all of our hormones are getting jammed signals and are being misused and misappropriated and mismetabolized. And so to me, I'm really concerned about the amount of exogenous hormones we continue to pour into an already overburdened system. So I'm a pretty big vocal antagonist to that movement, but only because I know what's inside that needs to be corrected first. And then if you do that, you often don't need the external support. So just an FYI. And then getting into stress, circadian rhythm drop in the bucket. My gosh, we are circadian beings. Every one of our cells even has their own circadian rhythm. Circadian biology is massive in the field of longevity and prevention of disease and the treatment of disease. And so getting your rhythm back on track is really important. And finally, the last big number 10 drop in the mitochondrial bucket is your mental emotional health. How are you dealing with that? Are you suppressing it? Are you drinking it into oblivion? Are you in denial about it? Are you actually working through rewiring your nervous system's response to the big and little T's of your life?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you for sharing those 10 points. One thing I wanted to add on, just to refer back to our studies and the circadian rhythm, actually, is something that Dr. Sachin Panda said when we recorded recently, is that there's a whole new area of medicine, which is around circadian, the timing of drugs and when they're taken. So let's just think for a second in some of these studies that they do where they have to drop people out. Imagine someone has 6 hours sleep and has a completely different circadian rhythm. And someone else has 9 hours sleep and goes to bed at a different time, wakes up, but they're given the same drug at the same time in a study, and they have different circadian rhythms and different effects. Like, how is that precision medicine in any way, shape, or form?
It is absolutely not. And I love that you guys got to interview him, because it's chronobiology, right? This whole study of when to time medications. I mean, there's certain phases of cancer in particular, like the S phase and the G phase and these other areas, that you can actually test in people to know what time of day are they expressing that particular phase, which is a more killable state. And there's so many people walking around. I think the studies show upwards of 70% of us actually have our most proliferative cells and therefore our most responsive cells to cytotoxic therapies like chemotherapy at night. And yet how many of us are in hospitals, or in drip stations after, 6 p.m., right? So there are definitely clinicians out there. I know Dr. Keith Block in Chicago does this. He'll send people home with basically a pack, like they basically go home with like a little chemo bag that goes off on a timer at the right timing of using this. So we can use medications in a much more N of one way. And I know that is the future of medicine. And I love these circadian biologists like Dr. Sachin Panda. Their work out there may be helping make this more a reality than just a theory.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I want to add to this is some people say, oh, you must hate the medical world. You hate medicine and stuff. No, I don't, actually. It's fantastic. It saved my ass several times. I'm very grateful for it. I think when something's not working completely, you have to search for what is also working, and then the two need to merge. And I think, Big Pharma listening to this, and, obviously they do. They listen to bloody everything, don't they? They try to pick holes in it. But the point is listening to this, we don't want to fight. What we want to do is we want to have an integrated approach. We want the best of both worlds so that people actually get better. And you can make money, but you don't have to make money from people dropping off the radar because they've not done the right things. I mean, it can be an integrated approach, right?
Well, and a really simple, here's where, without doing anything, you talked with your clinician, obviously, about this, but if someone's taking chemo, the studies, and Longo has great studies on this, is that if you're fasting 2 days before, the day of, and 2 days after, you will more impact the cancer kill effect of that chemotherapy further. You will also lower the risk of side effects, and you will lower the impact on the bone marrow. So you can actually maintain a more regular routine and get your chemo as scheduled at the right pace with keeping your healthy cells healthy along the way. Why is that not just standard of care? The same thing with radiation. Radiation, we know when your insulin or glucose levels are high, your cancer cells are desensitized to the radiation. Why the Are we having people rush through radiation, feeding them a cake before they go in there? A patient should be fasted when they go into their radiation. They should take a bump of exogenous ketones to potentiate the effect. They should be taking high doses of melatonin to sensitize the cancer cells to the radiation. And suddenly you are Trojan horsing that radiation right into the cancer cells while protecting the healthy cells. Loads of evidence. Like, this is not saying don't do radiation, don't do chemo. It's about doing them better. And so we, as integrative oncology experts, are trying to help our colleagues, our peers, have better outcomes. Because the burnout rate, the suicide rate, the depression rate, the addiction rate among oncologists is atrocious. And no one's approaching that, because imagine getting up every day and seeing failure after failure after failure after failure after failure. And your idea of success, what we celebrate as success and standard of care, is if they're 2.4 months alive after starting a new trial. That's the average overall survival rate of the drugs that have come out in the last few years, is that it's brought on a whopping 2.4 months of extended life with no question or conversation about the quality of that patient's life. How do you sleep at night? When your patients know more about nutrition and how to support themselves than you do? Working together as a team, putting the patient at the center of that equation and bookending them with an expert in the terrain, with an expert in the tumor, is a win-win-win-win-win for all parties involved.
Yeah, thank you. That was beautiful. It was beautiful. So, Nasha, we've been speaking for a while, and I've got one final question.
All right.
So, for the day, what do you think, or what do you want to be the major mindset shift for people around cancer?
Cancer is not the enemy. It's the messenger. And it's trying to tell you that there's a lot of things that are out of balance in the world around you, in the community around you, in the relationships around you, in the foods around you, in the body care products and the cleaning products and the cooking products around you, and the environment around you. And so it's an opportunity to learn about yourself and to be an activist for yourself, but also for your family, your communities, and the world around you.
Thank you, Dr. Nasha Winters. I love you. I love your work. I'm very, very grateful for you coming on today and sharing your wisdom with us. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very happy listening to this. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. It's been my honor.
You've been listening to the Health Optimization Podcast, and I'm Tim Gray. If you've enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. See you next time, and remember, let's spread the health.